Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to dive into this one with you. You know, whether you're a parent yourself or you've just watched families interact, we all get that universal drive to give kids the absolute best, right? We want them to have everything we didn't, and let's be honest, we hate seeing them upset. But there's this really tricky fine line between providing for a child and totally overindulging them. And when we cross that line, it sets up a pretty heartbreaking dilemma. Raising kids who eventually grow into spoiled, inflexible adults. So today, we're unpacking the deep psychological roots of overindulgence.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to actively reflect for a second. Picture this. A kid is throwing an absolute meltdown in the middle of a grocery store, and the parent finally just caves. They buy the toy, they buy the candy. What's actually driving that split-second decision? Like, why do we really spoil our children? It sounds like a super simple question on the surface, but the answer? It's incredibly layered. We usually tell ourselves we give in because, well, the kid is just so cute. Or maybe we just feel bad for them when they cry. But our source material reveals a huge psychological pivot here. Overindulgence? It is rarely about the child's cuteness. Instead, it's actually driven by the parent's own unhealed childhood needs and this immense, almost crushing guilt they feel when they're forced to say no.
To really grasp this, we have to look at how guilt gets tangled up with a parent's past. When you say no to a kid and the tears start flowing, it's not just annoying. For a lot of parents, it literally triggers a physical pang of pain in their chest. So to relieve that pain and just stop the crying, they give in. But here's the real kicker. By overcompensating later, buying the child whatever they want, the parent is often secretly satisfying their own unmet childhood desires. They're basically giving their kid exactly what they desperately craved back when they were little. Let's look at how this plays out in the real world. The author of our source text shares this incredibly vivid and honestly pretty shocking cautionary tale from their own upbringing. They call it the family cola incident. And this really prepares us for a raw look at what happens when a parent's unhealed past completely takes the wheel on their daily parenting decisions. So the author's dad constantly shared his own cola with the kids, totally unchecked. Because of this, by the time the author was in kindergarten, 90% of their teeth were completely black with decay. I mean, just imagine that for a second. But the truly wild part of this story is how the family reacted. Instead of stepping up, setting a boundary, and, actually parenting, the whole thing was absurdly laughed off. The kids were literally praised for having a hyena's sense of smell whenever they sniffed out hidden sweets in the house. It's fascinating to break down the father's specific behaviors that created this kind of environment. The guy had a severely unbalanced diet and a massive sweet tooth. We're talking eating 5 or 6 candies at once or literally drinking condensed milk straight out of the tube. Naturally, the kids just mirrored this. On top of that, he had this intense black and white thinking. If one of the kids threw a tantrum, he'd erupt in sudden anger and just cancel entire family outings on the spot. But then, a few days later, driven by that intense guilt we talked about, he would massively overcompensate, bringing home absolute mountains of presents. He acted more like an excited kid himself. You can only imagine the deeply confusing boundaries this created for those children. And that brings us to this generational timeline, which maps out the real-world consequences of these blurred boundaries. Because, let's face it, kids are incredibly observant. From a very young age, they learn exactly where they can push boundaries and where they absolutely can't. If a parent's childhood trauma from, say, the 1990s leads to guilt-driven overindulgence today in the 2020s, the child quickly learns that throwing a fit gets them a reward. Fast forward to the 2040s, and that child doesn't just magically grow out of it. If it's not corrected, they mature into an inflexible, selfish adult who struggles at work and in relationships, all because they never actually learned how to process the word no. So what does this all mean? How do we actually break the cycle? Well, let's pivot to the solution. The core message here is all about turning your past into learning. And I really want to reassure any parents tuning in. Your past trauma, or the mistakes your own parents made, they do not have to dictate a negative future for your kids. Absolutely not. But to avoid that trap, you have to actively translate your past experiences into structured, intentional wisdom. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast in how we can approach this. Say a parent grew up in poverty. The instinct, which is the bad approach, is to completely invert that and just spoil the child with endless luxury. But doing that totally robs the child of their drive. The wise approach is to teach them the actual effort of earning. Similarly, if you grew up experiencing deep loneliness, your instinct might be to spoil them by never setting boundaries just so they always like you. The wise approach, though, is to step in and overcome appropriate hardships together with your child. The text gives us some fantastic, highly specific examples of this wise approach in action. The golden rule is this: avoid simply repeating your past pain, but also don't completely flip it either. For instance, if you're wealthy now and your kid wants to study abroad, don't just write them a blank check. Co-plan with them. Support them in earning their own funds so they actually understand the value of a dollar. Or you could undertake a wilderness survival experience together to learn the true effort it takes to put a meal on the table. But crucially, and this is for sure the hardest part, parents have to be brave enough to endure their own emotional pain, that literal chest pain we talked about, when letting kids face these appropriate hardships. You have to sit with your own discomfort to let them grow.
Which brings us to what I think is the source's most powerful metaphor. If you've been carrying the pain of your past around like this heavy, crushing weight, it is time to reframe it. Your past is not a burden. It is a highly unique, invaluable asset. The author literally refers to a parent's life experiences as 100% pure educational material.
As the author highlights, this is material you simply cannot find in any textbook. Think about it. If you completely shield your kids from all hardship and just hand them everything on a silver platter, you are actually wasting your own life experience. Your personal history of overcoming struggles is this irreplicable, pure asset that no amount of money could ever buy. The past drives the present. By sharing the lessons of your hardships instead of hiding them, you're handing your kids a real-world roadmap for resilience.
Let's look at a really practical, everyday application of this concept from the author, specifically when it comes to diet. If you just flat out ban all junk food because you're terrified of bad health, kids are probably going to rebel, right? But if you combine structured discipline with planned joy, absolute magic happens. Try establishing a baseline of a daily healthy organic diet, maybe some additive free-dried fruits for snacks. Then contrast that with a rare, highly anticipated, once-a-month extravagant feast. This creates lasting, joyful memories and builds a really healthy relationship with food, all without the rigid trauma of total deprivation. So, the crucial point is how you actually implement this tomorrow. The source breaks this down into 3 super clear, actionable steps. First, take a step back and deeply analyze your own upbringing. Second, digest and elevate the meaning of those experiences. Actually, scratch that. Don't just digest them, elevate them. Don't just say, I was poor, so I'll make my kids rich. Figure out what poverty taught you about resilience and elevate that lesson. And third, gradually introduce appropriate hardship to your children. Don't throw them to the wolves, but please don't clear every single pebble from their path either. That's the real wounds to wisdom framework right there.
At the end of the day, every single parent wants to protect their child. But true protection, it isn't about removing every obstacle in their way. It's about equipping them with the strength to climb over them. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on today. How will you turn your past wounds into wisdom for your child's future? Take some time to reflect on your own history and recognize the absolute powerhouse of a teaching tool you hold within yourself. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and use your past to build a better future.